Mystery Quilters, happy August. Are you getting excited, or are you starting to think you know how the quilt goes together? It's going to seem very normal for 2 more months, and then I think that pattern is really going to throw you for a loop, what we do in 3 months from now, because it really kind of takes a left turn at Albuquerque. Today I am going to talk to you about grain in your fabric, and it's because we have to make these pieces this month, and the way they have you construct them is really weird. Also, we have a new videographer for August. You've had Jake, you've had Claire. Today we have Jim, recently retired and rapidly adding things to his resume. But anyway, so today we're going to talk about grain. Fabric has I guess it's 3 grain. I'm not sure if bias is bias an actual grain, Mom?
Yes.
Bias is a grain, so it has 3 grains, not 2. Lengthwise grain is the grain of the fabric that runs along the selvages. It's the length of the fabric you purchase, so it's the lengthwise grain. Now, what grain refers to is the way the fabric is woven together. And it's in a grid. It's just, it's warp and weft, but I can't ever remember which one is which. So fabric, threads running this way, threads running this way, and they're woven together, and they're creating a tiny grid that you can't see. Lengthwise grain is the strongest grain. If you look at this, I'm pulling on it, and the fabric is hardly giving at all. So there's no stretch at all to lengthwise grain. Now, crosswise grain is the grain between the 2 selvages. Okay, so from this edge to this edge, and this has some give. You can see that it stretches a little bit. It definitely stretches, here, let's do it this way. It definitely stretches more than the lengthwise grain did. Now, bias is when you cut an exact 45-degree angle between the threads that are woven together. And bias is very, very stretchy. Bias, you can watch, look at this, you can stretch quite a bit. If you ever are trying to bind a quilt with edges, the edges are wavy or rounded, we have a round table topper on display in the shop, you use bias binding. So use bias binding that's cut on the bias, because it'll stretch around your curves and give you really flat binding on those edges. Now, normally in quilting, we don't talk a lot about grain, even though we should probably talk about it more than we do. In garment sewing, they talk a lot about grain. It's very important, because if your pieces in garment sewing aren't cut on the grain correctly, then they can warp and distort. But today we're running into the way they're having you piece these pieces. If you're not careful, you're going to end up with warped pieces, and here is why. Normally, we've done a lot of half square triangles and quarter square triangles in this quilt. And normally, when you are making half and quarter square triangles, you take 2 squares and you sew them together, or you lay them on top of each other, draw your diagonal on, which is on the bias, and then you sew on either side of that line. We've actually had some people come in the shop and comment about, well, why wouldn't you just cut it and sew the 2 edges together? And bias and grain are the reasons you don't usually do that. If you think about it, when you're cutting your squares, you cut a strip, and you've got your selvage edge up here, and you cut your strip and you cut your square off. And your square should have a crosswise grain and a lengthwise grain, and it definitely has a bias. You can pull on it when you cut it, all those directions, and see. So normally, when you cut your squares to do your half square triangles, you have a square and you lay a square on top, and you've got your strong grains running, and you sew on your bias, and then you cut it, because having everything intact like that is going to help to stabilize your pieces a little bit, so you get pretty square pieces that way. But today, or this month, in the directions, they tell you to cut one square into 2 pieces. So you've got big triangles like this, and they tell you to take another square and cut it into all 4 pieces, into 4 triangles. I just haven't cut this one all the way. When you do that, you've actually now got one edge that's going to be either crosswise or lengthwise grain, and you've got 2 edges that are bias. So when you pick up your pieces to sew them together, these 2 pieces are sewn together on the bias here, and they're sewn on the bias here. So the question becomes, how do you sew these together if you've got a real stretchy one and a real stretchy one? If you put them together under your machine, watch, if I just pull on them enough, I can make it so that they're not even. We've got one slightly bigger already, and we haven't even put it through the machine yet. If we put this through the machine and we've done no pinning and we tug on it at all, and your feed dogs are pulling it, you run the risk of getting a very warped triangle. So what do you want to do? Well, the first thing is you want to pin for sure. The second thing is, if you have a piece that is larger, hold on one second.